Hi, this is Dr. Spencer Zimmerman with Functional Medicine Center of Boise. Today I wanted to talk to you about chronic fatigue, specifically chronic fatigue with a focus of the adrenal glands and ultimately what people call adrenal fatigue. Now, it should be noted that there are many reasons why someone can have chronic fatigue, and so it's important not to latch on to one specific part and say, that's it for me, because for most people, it's more complex than that. And so, for example, it can be thyroid, it can be anemia, it can be chronic unresolved infections, it can be concussions, it can be chronic stress, it can be digestive issues, leaky gut, it can be autoimmunity, and so many other things. So don't just latch on to one thing. It's important to address it all as a whole, but today we are going to focus on the adrenal glands, specifically what happens and why you get adrenal fatigue. Now, it should be noted that adrenal fatigue is not always a problem with producing enough cortisol, but it can also be a problem because you've produced so much, your body's no longer responding to it, so you feel as if it's not producing it. That should be distinguished based upon using lab tests. But let's get started. So I want you to imagine that you're going to go to the gym, you're going to work out. So now you're going, you're running, you're getting your heart rate up, you're exercising. So your brain's going to fire down into your adrenals. Your adrenals is going to cause the release of cortisol, going to cause the release of epinephrine. Now, as we know, epinephrine is going to increase your heart rate. Cortisol does a couple different things. One, it's an anti-inflammatory because as you exercise, your muscles are going to release some inflammatory chemicals. Two, it's actually going to help you have more forms of energy as it's going to go and break down stored forms of glucose. Okay, so remember that cortisol in the initial phase is anti-inflammatory when it's not constantly being used, and while our body is also receptive to cortisol. It's one of the reasons why if you know someone's got asthma, COPD, sometimes for really bad allergies or some of the viral infections, they'll give people steroid packs to help decrease that inflammation. Okay, but what happens with adrenal fatigue, once again, it can be decreased or your body's just no longer responsive to the amount of cortisol being released. And a good analogy for that is if you're a parent, relative, if you're an aunt or uncle, imagine your kid or your nephew or niece, they come up and they ask you questions. Or they're like, oh, I want to go to the zoo today. If they ask really nice and if it's the right time, you may say, yeah, let's do that. So that's normal. You're going to respond to it. That's like our body responding to cortisol. Now imagine, it's just not a good day to go. And they just keep asking you. I know it's happened to you. They ask you 100 times that day. You're more likely not to say, no, we're not going today. We're not going tomorrow. You know what? We're not going to go this whole year. You got to start doing some other stuff if you want me to do it. Same thing happens when we use cortisol for far too long. Our body no longer wants to respond to it, and it takes more to actually do it. So it ends up creating a loop where it's trying to survive and eventually make it to a point where it's not even going to produce the cortisol in the way we want it to. But it should be noted that it's still going to cause the release of epinephrine, and it's also going to cause the release of inflammatory chemicals. So we are going to end up with quite a bit of inflammation within our body. That inflammation in the body is also going to lead to inflammation within the brain. So now, if you look at our normal cortisol, let's say this is morning when we wake up, our cortisol should be highest first thing in the morning, and then should go down as the day goes on, and then it'll start creeping up again around 3 a.m., somewhere at that point in time. But for those of you who've got the chronic fatigue or know someone who has it, their cortisol may be really low during the day, and it may even spike a little bit before they go to bed. Now, this gives them two issues. You may have this. You wake up in the morning, you don't want to do anything. You don't want to get out of bed. You don't want to go to work. You're dragging and dragging and dragging. But You're so exhausted all the day, you want to go to bed, but now you can't go to bed. Your mind's racing. You don't know why it's racing. You want it to stop. You're trying everything in the world to make it stop, but it won't. So nothing's worse than being fatigued all day and then you've got insomnia at night. Okay. My preference for looking at this is using salivary cortisol. There are other methods that some providers like to use, but that really is my preference. And then it should be noted that abnormal rhythms are derived from the brain, specifically the hippocampus. Hippocampus is responsible for learning and memory. It's one of the parts that's really hit hard with dementia, but it's also responsible for our rhythms, so our circadian rhythms. Now, we're talking about circadian rhythms with cortisol, but it should also be noted that our own gut microbiome bacteria, our good bacteria within our gut, actually have their own rhythm too, which actually influences how well you digest foods and everything else in their functionality throughout the day. And we'll talk about that later, about why it's important to eat at certain times and different eating strategies that can help you. But I hope this did help answer some questions with adrenal fatigue. Look for the next video that I will do, where I'm going to talk about why cortisol with that our body's not responding to, and that inflammation not only decreases our immune response and creates inflammation within our body, but how it creates inflammation in the brain and why you may have depression as well as brain fog, and why that needs to be treated in order for you to ever truly have relief from your depression and brain fog.